Today's guest is Matthew Monk, the Linda Eaton Associate Curator of Textiles at Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library. When we think about the objects that preserve history, we often think of things like portraits, furniture, even handwritten letters, but some of history's richest stories have actually been stitched. Needlework has long been a part of everyday life, not just as decoration, but as a way of recording identity, marking milestones, expressing creativity, and preserving a sense of place. Every sampler, quilt, embroidered textile carries traces of the hands that made it and the world that those makers inhabited. In today's conversation, Matthew joins us to discuss his role at Winterthur, but also an upcoming exhibition, Stitched in Place, which explores how needlework has helped people understand and express where they belong. We explore how textiles become historical documents and what they reveal about daily life and why they endure. This is my conversation with Matthew Monk. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma's Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's Silver. Matthew, I'm excited to speak with you today. I would say this is like your welcome back, but we really didn't connect initially on a podcast episode per se. It was a recording that I then put onto the podcast. So welcome to your first official podcast episode of Grandma's Silver.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Could you tell everyone who you are, what you do, what your connection is? We can kind of take it all from there.
So I'm Matthew Monk. I'm the Linda Eaton Associate Curator of Textiles here at Winterthur. I've been in this job for about a year and a half now, a little bit more than. I'm also finishing my PhD, knock on wood, through the University of Delaware's American Civilization program, where I'm researching and writing about craft revival, but specifically sort of hand weaving revival in Appalachia and its relationship to the development of modern tourism, and also its icky connotations to sort of subversive white supremacy and nationalism and things at the turn of the 20th century.
All right. I don't even know where we go from there. Also, I didn't realize you were just shy of 2 years. How do we get here?
So I always tell people that textiles kind of saved my life. I'm Appalachian. I've lost a lot of my accent, but I grew up sort of around hand making and doing things, I guess, the old fashioned way. And I had the benefit of having grandparents that were kind of on the older side and sort of remembered the before times, as it were. They grew up during the Depression, still very much kept traditions about farming and canning and foodways and making and all of those things very much alive. And then I also had the benefit of having an aunt and an uncle who are sort of from the back to nature generation and were very interested in sort of reconnecting with their Appalachian heritage through the lens of the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so I grew up around a lot of farm animals. I grew up learning the old ways of doing things. And so that's always informed my interest in history and the past and understanding objects. My first questions are often about making. Textiles have always been a really important part of my life, although I sort of drifted away from that for a while. My grandma was an avid quilter, and she made all of her grandchildren, all 13 of us, our own quilt. I still have my grandma's quilt. And then my great-grandma and my great-great-grandmother, who I was lucky enough to get to know, they were quilters because they had to be. They both had very large families. They were both very poor. They had to quilt in order to provide blankets and warmth for their families. And so I still have a lot of those quilts as well. And those are by no means fancy or any type of sort of named pattern or anything like that. Those really are made from work clothes and scrap fabrics and flour sack backings and things like that. And so I treasure them. Those are some of my favorite things. So I grew up with those things around me all the time. Fast forward a lot to 2008, before I was living in Charleston, South Carolina, and I was working in restaurants. I was actually a bartender and a front of the house manager. The recession happened. And like a lot of people my age, I found myself in a financial situation that I didn't see a way out of. I ended up being one of those millennials that moved back in with their parents. And while I was feeling sorry for myself, I decided to go to Joann's one day and I bought the cheapest all wool yarn. I decided that I was not going to be a synthetic fibers guy, and I'm still not. Then I got a set of knitting needles and I taught myself how to knit. I had remembered how to do it. I learned earlier, but I never was good at it. And so I decided to start making things as a way to sort of mental health. I became really fascinated with the yarn itself. And the yarn was hurting my fingers. It was super rough. And it was actually sort of rubbing raw spots on my fingers. And so I was like, this is really gross, but I really want to finish this blanket. And I did. I don't use it. I have it, but I don't use it. It is unusably, uncomfortably scratchy. In the process of doing that, though, I found that there's these things called yarn stores. I didn't know that those existed before. And I was in Chattanooga, Tennessee at the time, and I actually went across the border to Georgia, to Dalton, Georgia. And there was a yarn store there that was owned by this very wonderful Danish woman, and she was trained in the Danish folk school system. And she used to joke with me. I was crocheting more than knitting at the time. And she used to joke with me in her very thick Danish accent that I was one of her favorite customers because I crocheted, and crochet uses 30% more yarn than knitting. In getting to know her and building a friendship and a relationship with her, she gave me her drop spindle and showed me how to spin yarn. A very serious habit was formed. So once I started drop spinning, I sort of got interested in fibers. The drop spindle was no longer fast enough or efficient enough for what I was wanting to do. So I got my very first spinning wheel, which I actually have beside of me in my office. I spin on a Kromski Minstrel. It's a Polish company that's still family owned and operated. And they make kind of, think like Rapunzel spindles, this sort of like stereotypical, lots of really wonderful carvings and spokes. It's a very, very lovely kind of wheel. And then I started sourcing fibers, and before you knew it, I was going to sheep and wool festivals, and I was competing with other folks for blue ribbon fleeces and scouring my own fleece. And then I built up confidence in a type of intellectual curiosity where I decided to kind of professionalize what had become a very serious hobby. And I went back to school. I went through the program at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I was a double major there in both history and medieval and Renaissance studies. So I joke with people and I tell them I'm a reformed medievalist, and I still use my medieval studies background in a plethora of ways. I first started off as a kind of an economic historian, thinking about the role that textiles played in the development of economy in Europe, and also the development of sort of a proto-industrial system of making through cottage industries and sort of city-based commercial activities. From there, I went to grad school at the University of Toronto, where I continued working on textiles, again, not necessarily from a decorative arts or material culture capacity, but from the capacity of economic history and social history. I found myself at the Smithsonian Program for Decorative Arts and Design History, which at the time was administered or overseen by George Washington University. I was still doing medieval things at that time. Found myself in coursework and also through the holdings of the Smithsonian working more and more with American textiles and American materials. And I found myself rediscovering my Appalachian roots. Started working with Madeline Shaw at the National Museum of American History. She's a retired curator of textiles there. I recatalogued all of the woven coverlets, which prior to that were basically coverlet, and that's basically all that was said about them. I re-examined all of these textiles, some of them being some of the earliest dated coverlets that exist in North America, all the way up to the craft revival things that are woven by Appalachian women that I'm sort of writing my dissertation about now. And so I recatalogued all of that. I got a Smithsonian Women's Committee fellowship to do this really fun oral history interview project where I interviewed different contemporary coverlet weavers and sort of used that to sort of showcase the importance of these textiles, not just in the past, but how that's still happening today. I applied to the University of Delaware. I always joke with my friends at Winterthur, the American Civilization program at the University of Delaware. As a part of that program, you get access to the Winterthur library collections. You don't get the same access as a Winterthur fellow in the master's program, but close. And so I always joke that before they hired me, I had been haunting the place for a few years. When I had the opportunity to apply for this position, I had to take it. I was very lucky to know Linda Eaton, whose position I carry in my, whose name I carry in my title. And she was a great friend and a good mentor to me. And I'm very grateful for the time that I got to spend learning from her and learning with her. And so it's a real honor to be able to do this work. And people have always asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I've always told them I wanted to have one foot in the classroom and one foot in the collections. As textiles curator, I'm also an affiliate professor in the Winterthur program in American material culture. So I teach the 8 fellows a year a textiles block, introduce them to sort of Textiles 101, how we work with them. And I also work very closely with a whole host of interns and fellows. And textiles are very important to me. It's something that I literally was spinning on a drop spindle this morning before I came in. I went to Maryland's Sheep and Wool in May, and I bought a Romney, a prize-winning uncovered Romney fleece, scoured it at Winterthur as a public event. And I've been hand carding and drop spinning the whole thing. And I'm going to take that yarn and dye it in an indigo vat this fall and hopefully start knitting a sweater.
Wow.
So it really will be from sheep to sweater.
That's so fun. There's so many things we can talk about here. The first, the layperson might be interested to hear is what does a curator of textiles do? And how are we understanding history through textiles?
I will actually answer the second part of that question first. So,
Okay.
for one thing, textiles bring people to museums, and I think that's because of their immediate. I talk about historical empathy a lot. We all have textiles in our lives. We wear textiles every day. We sleep under them. We wrap ourselves around them. They're very personal to us because they touch our bodies, and so there is this sort of like second degree reliquary sort of feeling about textiles. Clothing is literally a memory of a body that goes inside of them, right? They are an outline of a person. Quilts, for example, is something that I work very closely on, bed covers broadly. They are something that we cover ourselves, comfort ourselves when we don't feel well. They're things that we keep and associate with family members that have made them in the past. And on a deeper level, they are something that protects us and keeps us warm when we're at our most vulnerable, when we're asleep. And so there's this really deep subconscious, I think, resonance with textiles and humanity and humanness, and it's universal. There's textiles are in every culture. Textiles and ceramics are probably the oldest crafts that we have evidence of. Ceramics survive longer because they're fired, but even in those earliest fired ceramics, we see evidence of people actually pressing woven structures into the clay to create a texture. And so that's telling us that, even in these very old prehistoric objects, that textiles and this idea of sort of making is really precious and special. And even the term textile comes from the Latin textus, which is based in skill, sort of like artifact and skill. Yeah, so there's this, I guess, secret knowledge, but I find it to be a universal knowledge. It's something that sort of this need. We're mammals that don't have enough hair to keep ourselves warm. Or protect ourselves from the sun. And so there's this need for us to sort of supplement that lack of hair with some type of covering, whether it be, skins and furs of animals at first, or whether that turns into sort of using hair or wool from animals and fibers from plants to create, whether it's through felting or weaving or knitting or any other sort of structure, to create these sort of flat drapable surfaces, right? I think the sort of tactility and the softness of textiles is very important. Textiles invite you to touch them, although in museums we don't love that. So to answer the first part of that question about what does a textile curator do, object-specific curatorial positions are starting to fade away. We don't really talk about objects typologically in the same way that we used to. We're sort of evolving out of that. Traditionally, the Smithsonian or National American History Museum, I should say, is a good example of that. So there used to be, when it was the American Museum of Art and Industry, there were specific galleries for different typologies of things. And there was a textiles gallery. Here at Winterthur, in the galleries, which is separate from the house, until I think around 2015, there was a textile gallery. There was an entire, basically, like, here's the story of textiles in the United States. And while that serves a really important purpose, and I do teach that way, that's not really the best interpretive model, because these things are never made or used in isolation. There's a moment and a time in sort of curatorial practice when you want to isolate something and put it on a pedestal, if you will, quite literally, so that you can talk about sort of the special things about that object. But one of the beautiful things that I love about decorative arts and material culture is the idea that, like, these things, again, are never really isolated. They're made with the intention of being part of a larger complete, whether that's an interior or whether it's, a trousseau, or it's our function as sort of academics and curators to try to make interpretive points by isolating things and then putting them in conversations with other things that are isolated. But those objects have always been in conversations with one another. What something is not static either, right? So the quilt, when it was made, is different than the quilt when it's inherited, and is different than the quilt 100 years later when it becomes a museum object, right? Those things have many lives. Those lives are determined not by the object, but by the people that are engaging with that object. And that's also something that's incredibly important. Specifically at Winterthur, we have more than 90,000 plus objects. And inside of that grouping of objects, I always say it like this, I have about 24,000 object groups. A group of objects can have, parts 1 through 100, and then inside of those parts 1, A, B through Z. So I have many, many thousands of textiles in my collection here at Winterthur. They're largely divided, again, sort of typologically. It comes from sort of this older model of connoisseurship, which is important for understanding and for collecting, but as a historian is a tool in my toolkit rather than sort of where I stop. We think about textiles here historically. There's a printed textiles collection that's among one of the best in the world, not just North America. We have an impressive and growing collection of bed covers and quilts. We have over 600 quilts and over 1,200 quilted things. There's a furnishing textiles collection, and inside of that, there's a collection called the Original Construction Collection. And when I first got to Winterthur, that was a question that I asked myself was, well, what in the world does original construction mean at a place like Winterthur, where you're in this house that has 175 rooms and then this exterior gallery space? And it means furnishing textiles that still contain their original mountings. So thinking about sort of bed curtains with their original rings and pull systems, curtains with their original sort of tacks and things is still intact. And so those are very rare. Most of the times the textiles are repurposed or reused in some way, and that's how they survive. And in this case, these are textiles that really were taken down and put away and kind of forgotten about. And that's a blessing for those of us in the historic house field as we run up against furnishing plan changes, and we want to do things in a historically accurate way, but there's not always extant materials to sort of make those decisions on. So we have a very large collection of that, really under promoted collection of that I think is going to become something that's going to matter a great deal as other historic houses and other historic house museums run up against real needs to sort of update and make sure that they're still able to tell the story of how people in the past lived with objects. We have a huge collection of textile tools. Our second curator of textiles, Sue Swan, was a prolific embroiderer. She was a really skilled with the needle and thread. And so she worked for most of her tenure as a curator to really ramp up our needlework collection. And I've got my very first needlework exhibit just opened last week in the galleries. Something specific to this program is I advise master's students in the Winterthur program in American Material Culture, and then I also teach in that program. And I also facilitate our research fellows program, which brings roughly about 40 people in per year, a combination of what we call maker creator fellows and then research fellows. Before I started this job, I had a Winterthur dissertation fellowship. This institution is different than some other institutions because we do have the academic wing and we do have the research library as well. I mean, it is Winterthur Museum, Library, and Garden. So we really do celebrate all three of those aspects of this place here. So that's kind of in a very big nutshell. all of the kind of aspects of my job.
It opens the question for me of, you've touched on the fact that textiles are very fragile. Winterthur is unique in that it was a family home, but then there's also this museum element. So how many of the textiles were like a DuPont textile? And then how many things are you curating, and what does the preservation of these objects look like?
That's a great question. This year in 2026, it's our 75th anniversary as a museum. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of Henry Francis DuPont, who we call HF. It will be the 100th anniversary of him inheriting the house from his father. When HF inherits the house, he's already a collector himself. He's collecting mostly European antiques at the time, as was fashionable. And then when he inherits this property and he marries his wife, Ruth Wales, later DuPont, they purchase and expand on a home that's in Long Island called Chestertown. And that house is referred to, he actually refers to it as his experiment. And so I like to think about this house as a laboratory. And I think that, even though the Winterthur program in American Material Culture and then this place as a museum is 75 years old, it is, I often talk about like 100 years of textile study at Winterthur. That's the thing that I've sort of been using a lot as we approach the 100 years. From HF's time up until today, Winterthur as a whole represents the professionalization of the decorative arts field, the professionalization of sort of the academic museumification of that field. It starts with him figuring out a way to live with antiques. It's really important for me to point out that is a flavor of modernity. That's not somebody like living in nostalgia. He's actually living with the past in the present. He's not living in a fantasy world. These aren't period rooms. They're not outfitted or set up to probate inventories. They really are contemporary, early 20th century colonial revival interior decorating and interior design, which in and of itself was a new field. He's basically running up against a dichotomy of authenticity versus accuracy. And this is where the textiles become really important. So as he is acquiring American antiques, and I leave textiles out of this because textiles are not part of that equation for him yet, he recognizes the need to make those things livable. He's got to accentuate them. And it's the textiles that do that. It's the textiles that kind of bring his collections of ceramics and furniture and metal to life. He's trained as a horticulturalist. He's a graduate of Harvard. He is also a very consummate businessman. So he's on the board of General Motors. He runs Winterthur Farms, where he uses his background in horticultural animal husbandry to develop a type of Holstein, like a breed of Holstein cow that produces milk with a higher fat content than any other cow. So Winterthur butter and Winterthur milk is quite famous in the 30s. He's not just this guy that collects and lives with his antiques. He is a business person, and he is a DuPont in the truest sense of that word. The house starts in Chestertown, and he is decorating it with American material culture, which is new. He's decorating it with a lot of things that we might consider folk art. And for him, that is exotic. He grew up in a Gilded Age mansion full of Gilded Age European antiques and Gilded Age European revival antiques or revival decorative arts. Sort of think very large, robust, vibrant, sort of thing. Very beautiful, but not American. There's a bit of a legend. The DuPonts, Ruth and Henry Francis, take a vacation to go visit their good friends, the Webbs in Vermont. And they are consummate collectors of Americana. And so he sees a China press from Vermont, and is really taken by this China press that, you know, in any other sort of context would probably have just been like, okay, it's a place to store your dishes. But for HF, it really was a sort of an aha moment about, number one, the beauty of American craftsmanship in a moment when we are becoming an industrial superpower. And there's a real fear, I think, on his part that we're going to lose that story. So he works very hard to start collecting and living with those things, because that's the type of modernity that he wants to live inside of, right? So there's different flavors and different options of that. And for him, it is living with these objects from the past. And so he creates this house in Chestertown. As soon as it's set up, his father passes away. And so they inherit this house as well. So now he's got two homes to outfit. He creates this massive wing off the older parts of the house, really expanding the number of rooms, I think 200%. So we say we have 175 rooms at Winterthur. A lot of those 175 rooms are former closets and bathrooms and dressing rooms and things that when he decides to turn the house into a museum, they sort of take all of that out of the house in favor of creating more space to put Americana. Like, you can't go see the bathtub that Mr. DuPont used. It's not like you go to Biltmore where you see like the family's living quarters. We still interpret Mr. DuPont's room and Mrs. DuPont's rooms. They're still set up as if they're their rooms, but their dressing rooms and bathrooms and things have all been turned into other sort of interpreted spaces where we use and showcase those things. And it's the textiles that really help him bring those rooms together. One of the things that's quite modern about the way that Mr. DuPont uses his textiles is this idea of seasonal changes. Before industrialization, textiles are the most expensive thing a person can own because of the amount of labor that's involved in them. So before there's all of the machines to do all of the work for you, before the gins and the power looms and the spinning jennies and all of those things, it's human labor, from the growing to the processing to the spinning to the weaving to the dyeing to the finishing to the making. All of it is people. And so every time there's a hand involved, something gets more expensive. So all you have to do is look at historic probate inventories to understand that often the most expensive objects in a household are the textiles. But those are what make the space livable and comfortable and homey. That's what turns it from, a house to a home. What Mr. DuPont's able to do is start decorating with historic textiles. And so he creates and he doesn't invent, but he adopts this idea of seasonal changes. And he's using his horticultural background to really create a type of harmony with the interior spaces of the house and the exterior spaces of the gardens, which is also working with Marion Coffin to sort of develop this beautiful, naturalized, but still very much maintained landscape. And so whatever's happening outside the windows of the room is actively being reflected in the textile choices that he's using. So he is quite literally bringing the outdoors in. All of the rooms have at least 4, sometimes more, seasonal changes. And so that facilitated the need for him to start, shall we say, massively collecting textiles, but he's treating them differently than the other antiques. There are not the mechanisms in place yet. So the Brunswick and Fees of the world, the Schumachers, the Scalamandres, they are fabric houses, but they're making like Victorian revival textiles. So they're appropriate for Gilded Age interiors, but they're not really appropriate for American interiors, or right, they're not historically accurate in the true sense. And so for Mr. DuPont in the early days, it is more about sort of the authenticity of the material than any type of like accuracy to history. If you've got a room where the furniture in the room is from the 1770s, well, then you must have textiles from the 1770s. And so you're also looking for the best quality textiles. Textiles don't age well. Natural dyes are not light fast. The more light they get on them, the more faded they get. He is salvaging textiles from, we would not do this today, but he is salvaging textiles from things like the backs of quilts, from dresses, and he's using dress fabrics because of the way that dresses are made. They're not pieced together, they're not tailored. They're like tuck pleated and gathered and things. So they're selvage to selvage usable fabric in most women's clothes. And so he's able to have upholsterers take those tuck pleats out, and suddenly you have this large piece of fabric that's absolutely perfect for recovering your 1770s sofa. It's not ideal for using because that fabric weight and its structure and everything was intended to be a garment and not sat on over and over and over again. But it looks beautiful, and it is historically or appropriate, I should say, not accurate. It's the right time period. It's the right materiality. It is, in all intents and purposes, the closest you could get to right at the time. He's having to figure it out himself, and he's doing that with the help of an upholsterer named Ernest Lonano. Ernest Lonano is a junior, so there's actually three Ernest Lonanos. There's Ernest Lonano 1, 2, and 3. Mr. DuPont works with the first two, and the first Ernest Lonano is most famous for installing the furnishing plans for the Met's American Wing when it opens in the 1920s. And it's through Fisk Kimball at the Pennsylvania Museum, now the Philadelphia Museum of Art, that introduces HF to Mr. Lonano, to Ernest Lonano, and they form this really fast friendship. Ernest Lonano the first dies, unfortunately, young, and so his son takes over. And so Ernest Lonano II becomes the primary Ernest Lonano and does a majority of sort of the upholstery and curtain work for the house. And so him and his staff start using the textiles that HF has been collecting to reupholster and update the houses, create a whole series of curtain rotations, not just for this house, but for the house in Chestertown. They've, by this point, also gotten a townhouse in Manhattan and will later also purchase a very large estate in Boca Grande, Florida. Think about this collecting. You've got 4 very large homes to fill with all kinds of Americana, and all of the textiles are being rotated out in all of those rooms 4 times a year. Here at Winterthur, when Mr. DuPont decides that he actually wants to turn this into a museum, and part of this is because people were asking to come and see the house. And so when he was here, people would write him letters and ask if they could please come and see his collection. He's writing articles for like Magazine Antiques and things like that in the 30s and 40s. So people are aware that he's a major collector. His property, although it's a private home, is still a place that you want to go see, right? He also, I don't want to say professionalizes, but kind of professionalizes the circuit that he's running with too. So early on, he's working with Bertha Bankard, who is a socialite from Long Island and also one of the original interior designers, original professional interior designers. She does the interior design work for some pretty famous hotels in New York City. And she really helps him develop his eye. He's got a great eye for color and design and things, but he always runs things through her. So it's a combination of Ernest Lonano and Miss Bankard at first. Ms. Bankard passes away in the late 30s and is not replaced, but is sort of the next group of people that come and help advise Mr. DuPont are from the curatorial world. And so this is where Mr. DuPont is sort of shifted away from thinking about designing and interior design towards really like academic level collecting, trying to get the sort of the best of the best and making sure that he has representative examples of furniture from this maker, furniture from this location, ceramics from here, right? Making sure that he's got a really nice encyclopedic collection. And so it's that shift from thinking about living with it to collecting it. And then what are you going to do once you have this big encyclopedic collection that leads him to think about actually turning this into a museum, and not just a museum, but like a learning laboratory for how to do this kind of work. The idea for opening up the museum is done in tandem with the idea of creating an academic program. He brought in some curators to advise. They went through the process of sort of creating the museum, as it were, and also built a cottage. It's now our gift shop. And that's where the family moved. So the family actually moves out of the house in the 40s into the cottage. They have their own sort of family antiques and things. So he doesn't get rid of all of his father's furniture, even though he doesn't really love all the Gilded Age things. And also the family being DuPont, they have a very close forever association with their French heritage. They speak French in the home and all of these things. So they keep their sort of Francophone roots alive. But it's his real passion for Americana and also sharing that story with other Americans that I think really leads to the creation of this place. Mr. DuPont passes away, and part of his will is expresses to sell the other properties and then bring everything here. So our largest accession number is the year 1969. And so if it's got a 1969 number here, it's something that Mr. DuPont personally owned up until the time of his death and enters the actual museum collection during that sort of the settling of his estate. A really wonderful collection of those textiles, thinking about just the textiles from that period, that were used in all of the houses. And he rotates the furniture and the textiles. You can follow his letters in the archives and the research library. And it's really interesting. He has no problem just like changing his mind about things. And many of the rooms have sometimes 3 or 4 different furnishing plans during his lifetime, right? There's sort of the way that he lived in it. Then there's the way he was going to set it up when he moved out into the cottage. And then there's the way that it was set up when the museum opens. And then he passes away. And then that's when that first group of Winterthur fellows and those curators start doing things in a more academic way. And so then they actually sort of, I talk about, they decolonial revival a lot of the things. So a lot of the textiles, he talks about sort of made up textiles, made up curtains and made up bed covers. And what he means is they're kind of Frankenstein textiles, but it's really wonderful. And we have those. I don't think about those as like tee-hee. For me, it's best practice starts with a practice. There weren't really any other options. So in order to have this kind of authentic textile, you had to use the best pieces of the textile and then kind of puzzle piece them together using the expert handwork. And everything is done by hand by Ernest Lanano's staff. And then everything then is trimmed with this colonial revival trim, which is brand new. And so there's something about taking the best parts of something old, putting them together, and then outlining them with this colonial revival trim and sort of passementerie and things that really works. It really looks incredible. It's not historically accurate, but it is historically accurate for the 1930s. So, almost 100 years later, there's actually like a real history there that I'm so proud of, and I'm so glad that we still have. Mr. DuPont understood that what he was doing with those textiles was different. I won't say it's wrong, but he realized that it was different because he kept all the pieces. So if he cut something up, he kept all the scraps, and I have all of them. So there's stories inside of those objects and behind those objects as well about sort of understanding how he was using textiles to create livable things. He's living with them. He's using them. He's sleeping under those quilts. In fact, 4 of our quilt collection are some quilts that he deemed to be sort of not of lesser quality, but ones that he didn't care as much about. And if you were invited to stay here, the staff kind of kept tabs on your cleanliness. And if you were deemed to be someone that was not up to like his cleanliness standards, you would get a lesser quality quilt on your bed that he didn't care about. It's, in my opinion, time to bring those back. That's kind of what's missing, I think, from some historic house interpretation models. And something that we have the freedom to do here because our building was built in the 1929 to 1931 range and then, outfitted with historic architecture and antiques and things. And so it's not a period house and not period rooms. There's a lot of leeway with how we interpret that space. If you actually wanted to interpret that wing of the museum wing of the house in terms of a period room, it would be most appropriate to sort of re-colonial revival everything, put the trims back on everything, bring the things out that are anachronistic, bring the things out that are, historically inaccurate from a 1770s point of view, but are absolutely spot on for the 1930s.
This is blowing my mind in the interpretation of it all because he was seasonally minded. Is that something that Winterthur is then also doing? What I'm hearing is he may have brought a piece into his own collection, and that piece was really not meant to be seen outside of spring.
We've actually interpreted the seasonal changes in different capacities since the museum opened. That capacity has shifted for a variety of reasons, mostly because of staffing and sort of the amount of work that it takes. When Mr. DuPont was still alive and living in the space, he had a full domestic staff, right? So there's a full group of people that are in charge of just taking care of not just like all of his houses. So when he's still living in the spaces, it's kind of interesting. The way that the textiles are kept speaks to sort of the role that textiles historically have had for collecting and antiques. Of course, if you've got 4 houses, you can't live in all 4 houses at one time. The family has a kind of a cycle of living in these spaces, and they're at Winterthur during the spring for the blooming of things, and they're here for the holidays because it is sort of the family seat. The rest of the year, they're in the other properties. So when the house is not being occupied by the DuPont family during the times that they're living in it, those rotations are kind of paused and the textiles are taken down, rolled up, and they're put in the drawers of the furniture. Mind you, the textiles, when he's living with them, they're fading in the sun. They're being used up. If you sit on a woven silk fabric that's made for a dress for 10 years, you will notice that it will be threadbare and you will have holes in your silk. So he's having things reupholstered constantly as well, which means he's constantly acquiring new historic textiles to use again and again and again and again. And he doesn't have any problem having things re-dyed. For him, it's about sort of the accuracy of the material, not the authenticity of the way he's portraying it. The furniture, he really loves a slip cover for like larger pieces of furniture. So it'll have its main upholstery, and then he has seasonal slip covers for things like sofas and easy chairs, side chairs and armchairs that have slip seats. Well, that's lovely. He'll just have extra slip seats made and have, these sort of seasonal rotations. And then curtains, there's usually 3 to 4 sets of curtains. Any type of bed hanging will have different valances and things like that. As he starts living more primarily here, the plumber used copper pipe to make this really wonderful sliding system of storing the textiles, so they can be stored hung, and it makes for better rotation. And so when the staff was at its full capacity and not a museum, those rotations were happening regularly, like every 2 to 3 months, and they're not. They're labeled on the curtains. So the curtains that are made by Ernest Lanano, they all have tags on them. They tell you exactly what room the curtain is for. Sometimes the curtains actually rotate. So sometimes in spring it will be in this room, but in fall it will be in this other room. So sometimes the curtains have 2 lives in 1 year.
Wow.
They're even more specific than sort of what room. It tells you which window and which panel. They're very specific. And then they devise even a system of hanging them that makes it faster to rotate. So they actually use modern things like tapes with snaps, button snaps that are not historical in any capacity. They're very modern, but they are easy to install. They're easy to take down. And so there's these like balance frames that everything sort of snaps onto. We still have those systems in place, and they're wonderful, and I'm glad that they exist. As we turn into a museum, we no longer need a housekeeping staff because, well, people aren't living in the property in the same capacity. And it shifts to museum staff, which has its own sort of different parameters for how we handle and access. We're clearly not rolling them up and putting them in drawers anymore. It sort of goes back. It sort of shifts back. We're still doing it because that's something that we can use to talk about sort of Mr. DuPont's use of the textiles, and then also show more textiles. But it is 100% brought to you by late Victorian, early 20th century ideas about sort of housekeeping and good interior design. And if you can afford to swap your curtains out to match the seasons, and it really does. If you see, there's wonderful stereoscope photos of some of the rooms from the 1930s, and you can see what the seasonal changes actually look like. Those are digitized and in the on the library's website. So I would encourage everybody to go peek at them. As the museum professionalizes, they shift to doing rotations twice a year. So instead of having 4 seasonal rotations, they have 2 seasonal rotations. In the 20th century, they started doing rotations in specific rooms at specific times of the year. As the house professionalizes, I mentioned that they sort of decolonial revival things. Mm-hmm. Things also start wearing out. There's a need and a moment in interpretation for museums where having reproduction fabrics makes it easier for you to tell a story that's grounded in 1770 or 1820. If you can have a textile that is a fresh reproduction of a historic one that'll have light damage and actually look kind of old, it gives you a completely different feeling of those spaces. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's sort of 3 waves of furnishing plan revamping. So they're partnering with Brunschvig and Fee. Mrs. Brunschvig makes our first reproduction textile on the behest of some of the curatorial staff. And then we start, licensing products and things like that, just like, all other of the Colonial Williamsburg and everybody else that has large historic textile holdings does. Those are wearing out, right? Those reproduction textiles. And it's not just at Winterthur, it's across the board. The Nylanders wrote these wonderful series of books about sort of furnishing plans and how to source your fabrics and window treatments and things in the late 70s after the bicentennial. And in the back of those books is this wonderful, but now sort of very much outdated resources list. So basically a bibliography of like how to get these things for your historic site. And this was used by people that own historic homes and live in them, and also people that interpret historic homes from a museum capacity. All of those businesses are now gone, or they're in sort of larger corporate hands. And so it's harder to reach out. There's no Mrs. Brunschvig to reach out to anymore. It's also the fashionability and sort of the usability of these things. Colorways from the mid 19th century are no longer as desirable as they were maybe in the 1970s and 1980s. They don't see as much sort of advantageous reason for them to reproduce a small run of something for us. And so we're not just Winterthur, but all historic houses are running up against sort of aging and fading interior plans, furnishing plans for their homes. And so I've been working and thinking about how to create a scalable and sustainable version of rotation inside Winterthur, and using our resources and the scope of our collections to try to figure out how to do that, not just for us, but how to share that with the larger historic house field, and also with people that own historic homes that are interested in, and again, living not in the past, but living with the past.
Right.
How do you do that in a way that looks nice, doesn't have, heavy metals on it, is safe to live with, and then also, looks looks fresh and looks new. I've isolated one room, which we did a floor survey. So we have a curatorial or a conservation program here as well that take care of all of our things, not just the textiles. There's 2 textile conservators, a textile conservator volunteer, and then there's also a conservation graduate program as well, one of only 4 in North America. So we have the benefit of having our own textile conservation lab, working with our preventative conservators, working with our textile conservators, working with our registrars, and then working with curatorial collectively to think about how not just to sort of address some of the wear and tear issues and fading issues that are in those rooms, but use this as a moment and use what we are as a way to really help create new paths forward for doing this kind of work and working inside of the corporate worlds that we have now, which is, again, exactly what Mr. DuPont's doing in the 30s. Him and Ernest Lonano are figuring out how to make it work in real time until the market recognizes that this is actually sellable and that you can actually reproduce textiles from the 1780s to the 1850s. And then, there's actually going to be people today that will buy those things. We're going to try to do it one room at a time. And I'm doing that in the Patuxent room, which is on the 6th floor. It's a bedroom. And what I'm proposing, and I'm actually in the process of sort of scheduling this to happen now, is putting out the seasonal changes all at once. There's a 4-sided bed there, and there's 4 windows, and there's about 16 chairs. So there's all kinds of opportunity there to put out a little bit of all 4 of the seasons at the same time. It's going to look a little kaleidoscopic, but it's going to provide the first opportunity for visitors to actually see what all 4 of those seasons look like without us just talking about the fact that existed, or them being able to just see one of the seasonal changes at a time. And with all of our sort of partners in the museum, think about how to reinterpret those spaces for each of our considerations, for the conservation consideration, for the interpretive point, for the textiles point of view, and really kind of do a holistic reevaluation of how we're telling the stories of the objects in those rooms. And it really is the textiles that tie those together. All you have to do is look at those stereo card photos from the 30s to see like how much of a difference having like an all green palette versus a maroon palette versus, a chintz palette really changes the entire feel of those spaces. It actually changes the way that the antiques look, the way that the furniture looks, the way that the ceramics pop out or don't pop out, whether they blend in or not. I mean, it's truly amazing. And he really had a wonderful eye for understanding that. But then you also just have to sort of be here for an entire year to look out the windows, to understand what's blooming or what's turning orange in the fall, to understand what's actually informing those decisions too.
Getting into, is it Stitched in Place? I'm looking at my note right now. So it's Stitched in Place.
Stitched in Place is the needlework exhibit, yeah.
Yeah. So what's the inspiration? Why now?
It's called Stitched in Place, and it's inside of a larger gallery exhibition called Conversations with Collections, where curators use accessioned objects in our collection to tell very specific sort of smaller stories of the impacts of the collection here and also sort of on the larger world of America and our field as a whole. Stitched in Place is asking our visitors to look at and consider how needlework, and that is a broad category, so it's more than just embroidery, but how needlework, so anything made with a needle and thread, both the people that make it and also how it's used, how those objects are then used by Americans to sort of create and help them understand their place in the world and also how they see themselves in the world. And that can be geographic, and it can also be a little bit more, I don't want to say theoretical, but places like religious communities as a place, home as a place, family as a place, part of sort of global trade networks and imperial networks, the larger British imperial world, the Atlantic world, access to trade routes, things like that. So this exhibit is the sort of revamping of a needlework exhibit that traditionally happens every 2 to 3 years at Winterthur, and was started by my predecessor, Linda Eaton. And that exhibit was always paired with a conference, a needlework conference or symposium. Traditionally, it's been embroidery. So it's been samplers, silkwork pictures, those kinds of things. I wanted to, and I do in this, expand on that a little bit. There's still samplers, there's still silkwork, needlework, there's a woolly in there. There's still very traditional, sort of what you would expect from a needlework exhibit. But I also put things in there like a Mexican dechado, which a Mexican dechado is a Mexican version of a sampler. I put in some sleeve bands that come from China that are very important Chinese embroidery. I put a piece of shibori, which is basically Japanese resist dye. That piece of shibori has a very interesting history as sort of a DuPont object. So the DuPont Corporation, because of the paint and their roles in sort of synthetic textiles and everything else, also was interested in dye stuffs. And so they had agents in India sourcing indigo, and they had agents in Japan as well. And so the textile that's out there is a good example of how needle and thread can be used to execute a printed textile, essentially. But there's no needle and thread present in it now, but its pattern is brought to you by the use of a needle and thread. And that textile says something very specific about where it came from and who made it and the type of people, where those people were, who they were, and how those textiles are used. The exhibit is divided into three major components, and it's place depicted. There's an object in there that's Erica Wilson's view of Nantucket. Erica Wilson is a 20th century embroidery superhero. I call it, she is quite literally the Julia Child of needlework. She had a show on PBS, and she really did revive the practice of embroidery for American women in the middle of the 20th century. There's also a very important needlework picture of Penn's treaty with the Lenape that was made in 1776 in England. And so thinking about sort of this mythological image that was almost 100 years old in 1776 of, Penn trading bolts of cloth with the Lenape on the banks of the Delaware, which, is not exactly how that went, and how sort of that image is being reproduced with needle and thread by a woman in England as a way of understanding her place, not just in England, but as a British subject of this huge expanding global empire, right? So she's depicting something that happens in another continent in England. At the same time, the rebellion, which we're celebrating 250 years of, is about to start. And so there's this sort of really deep-seated understanding of how people are using craft and using thread and needle to really understand their, not just their place physically in the world, but their overall place in the world. The other sort of takes are place inscribed. I've got a kettle holder. It was made in 1814, and it's got a lovely verse on it. The maker identifies herself as a New Englander. She's in Maine. She's in the province of Maine in 1814 when the northern part of that province is being occupied by the British in the middle of the War of 1812. And so she's taking a moment in the middle of like the troops literally being on the outskirts of her hometown to write a message in her kettle holder where she identifies herself not as a Massachusetts person, but as a New Englander, which I think is also a really important distinction because right after the War of 1812, the province of Massachusetts becomes the state of Massachusetts. And they were in the process of trying to do that before the War of 1812. So it's this sort of like nuance, this very subtle distinctions of how people are actually like leaving records, both visual and typological records, but also records in the terms of the way that they're styled. And so the third category is place implied. There is a Pennsylvania German sampler in there, that particular section, along with the Japanese fragment, the Mexican dechado, and the Chinese sleeve band. And all of those tell you something about place because of the way that they look. The types of stitches that are used, the materials that are used, right? There's something that's implicit about where these things come from, who made them, and that tells you something about who made them. And then also there's another sense of place, thinking about sort of imported goods being used by Americans to express their access to other places, their connectivity to other places. Or in the case of the Pennsylvania German sampler, a connection to a place that they no longer live. So I've also incorporated a section for tools in there because, again, these things don't make themselves. And I think it's important not just to show the finished object, but also the tools and the objects that the people that made them would have used. So things like that are what really are informing this exhibit. The Needlework Conference will be returning. That will be happening March the 19th through the 21st, and it's going to be 2.5 days of lectures, conference presentations, panel discussions, tours of conservation, special tours of the house, tours of needlework study, which is a treat unto itself, and then actual workshops. And there's workshops for everybody. There's workshops for people that are consummate embroiderers. Trisha Wilson Nguyen, who owns Thistle Threads and is like one of the consummate embroiderers in the world, going to lead a multi-day workshop. And then there's also Sharon Verbos, who we work very closely with, who owns Purple Thread, is also going to be offering some entry-level workshops.
Awesome.
And there'll be more information coming out about that.
And I'll add that links to everything will go in the show notes. But one, you touched on, I talk about legacy all the time here. I'm curious if there's anything specific that you're hopeful that someone would walk away from seeing the new exhibit. Like, what message are you hoping that someone is taking away there?
Yeah, so I mean, in the introductory panel to that exhibit, I really do ask the visitors to not just think about these objects, but to think about how the things that they own and use. I'm not assuming that most people are like consummate embroiderers just because we do live in like a post-industrial world. So there's not really the need for us to, have marking initials on our shirts. We aren't communally doing our laundry, most of us. So we will get our shirt back. And most of us don't feel the need, although there is a resurgence of this, of sort of putting personal embellishments on the things that we own. But we do, as consumers, sort of select and curate our own, we style ourselves in a very literal sense. And so thinking about objects that, are made with needles and thread, whether even if that's from a sewing machine, from a factory, right? Even Temu or Shein clothes are still made with needles and threads, and there's still somebody somewhere else making those for you, even if you're not making your own clothes. And so thinking about it, I challenge the visitors to really think about how needles and thread and the people that make things with needles and thread, and how then we use those objects to sort of define ourselves and really understand how we see ourselves in the world and how we want other people to see us in the world. And that's these objects historically for women primarily, they were objects that, showed their skill, they showed their education level. They were in lots of ways kind of evidence of who they were, who they saw themselves, who they wanted to be. And they were as much for the person that made them. And sometimes they are educational lessons, but they're also shown, and particularly now, right? Even so, Pennsylvania German samplers is a good example of that. The samplers in Pennsylvania German culture aren't often framed and used in the same way that English samplers were, right? English samplers are sort of understood to be this thing that you frame and you hang in the parlor, and it is sort of like your diploma, if you were, that not only do you know ABC 1, 2, 3, you also understand like spatial reasoning. You may have gotten some botanical knowledge in there, it's a science lesson or two, a geography lesson, things like that. But it is to show essentially that like you are able to educate your children, because the first school for most early Americans is right at mom's knee. You're marriageable material. For Pennsylvania German girls, those objects are made so that they can learn how to do the stitches to decorate the other textiles in their lives. And those samplers are not often displayed. They're often put in a chest or a drawer. And so they're kept and they're shared. They're documents of sort of, and they pass down. So like if you can find samplers that come from successive generations of the same family, you'll see that like somebody looked at mom or grandma's sampler and they collected a pattern that they liked. And so there's all of this sort of like thinking about legacy. That's why these things are kept and they're preserved. People have decided that these things matter. So thinking about how we use the things that we own and make to tell ourselves who we are, but also to tell everybody else who we want to be seen as, is really what's at the heart of this exhibit. And also pushing just a little bit beyond sort of samplers and needlework pictures, which are incredibly important and beautiful, but that's not the only things that are made with needle and thread. They are exceptional and they're extremely beautiful, but honestly, most people's embroidered worlds are much less complex than that, but no less important. I'm really excited and I get really jazzed about the opportunity to really tell more American stories through objects. Yeah, so that's a big part of what I do here. I oversee the things we have. I think about how we can use them to tell new stories, different stories, more inclusive stories. And then I'm actively working with collectors and other types of people in the larger market to make sure that we are able to tell all of those stories the best way that we possibly can.
What's at the very top of your wish list right now?
Oh gosh, I would love to have a Hawaiian quilt, some early Chinese American textiles. I would love to have some Japanese American objects. I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about and expand upon our Latin American material culture here. We have a few pieces. We have a wonderful, beautiful rebozo, which is this very large sort of shawl-like wrap.
Okay.
It's gorgeous. And we have a growing collection of dechados, Caribbean objects. I would love to have some more Canadian things.
Okay.
Hooked rugs, which we have a very large collection of hooked rugs. HF was actively collecting those. We have lots of things from the sort of early days of colonial America and federal America, but there's a plethora of opportunity for us to continue to collect and grow and expand.
Matthew, thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. It was, I could have talked to you for another 2 hours. There's so much to explore, but I am so glad to have had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about your very busy corner of Winterthur.
It's always a pleasure to chat with you, Allie. Thank you so much for having me on today.